"You're worthless, Faith. Absolutely worthless. I don't know why we even keep you around." The words hit me like ice water as I stood frozen outside my own kitchen, groceries still clutched in my hands. My son-in-law Pascal was talking to my daughter Sylvia, thinking I was still at the store. "She's just taking up space in our house, eating our food, using our utilities. What does she even contribute?" I watched through the window as he gestured dismissively toward the living room, where I'd been folding their laundry just an hour before. "Honestly, Sylvia, your mother is like some kind of parasite. We're supporting a 68-year-old woman who does nothing but get in the way." 10 years. 10 years I'd been living in what I thought was our family home, helping raise my grandchildren after my husband passed, cooking their meals, cleaning their house, watching their kids while they worked late or went on date nights or weekend trips. 10 years of believing I was needed, wanted, part of something bigger than just myself, rattling around in an empty house somewhere. 10 years of waking up at 5:30 every morning to make Pascal's coffee the way he liked it, strong, with just a splash of cream, and packing lunchboxes for Emma and Jake, my beautiful grandchildren, who called me Mimi and ran to me when they had nightmares. But standing there with a bag of groceries I'd bought with my Social Security check, listening to the man I'd helped support call me a parasite, I realized I'd been living in a fool's paradise. The sharp pain that lodged itself in my chest, like the tip of a needle, wasn't just hurt, it was clarity, cutting through years of willful blindness, like sunlight through fog. Sylvia's voice drifted through the window, and what she said next nearly knocked me to my knees. "I know, Pascal. Sometimes I wonder what Dad was thinking, leaving her so dependent on us. But what choice do we have? She has nowhere else to go, and the kids love her." Her tone was resigned, like she was talking about a stray cat they'd foolishly taken in and now couldn't get rid of. I set the groceries down quietly on the porch step and walked to my car on unsteady legs. I needed to think, and I couldn't do it in that house. Not anymore. Not ever again, if I was being honest with myself. I drove to Riverside Park, the same place I used to take Sylvia when she was small, when she'd run to me with scraped knees and hurt feelings, when I was her whole world and she was mine. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was seeking comfort in a place where I'd once been the one providing it. Now I sat on a bench facing the water, watching ducks paddle in circles, and tried to understand how I'd become so expendable to the daughter I'd raised to be independent and strong. Maybe that was the problem. I'd raised her too well, taught her to see weakness as something to be managed rather than nurtured. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter. I pulled my cardigan tighter around my shoulders, the blue one Sylvia had given me for my birthday last year. Back when I still thought such gestures meant she cared about me rather than just fulfilled obligations. Everything felt different now, tainted by the knowledge of what they really thought of me when they didn't think I was listening. The thing about being 68 years old is that you've accumulated a lifetime of experience reading people, reading situations. You learn to notice the small signs, the way someone's eyes don't quite meet yours when they say they're happy to see you, the slight pause before they agree to something, the way conversations stop when you enter a room. I'd been noticing these things for months, maybe even years, but I'd been explaining them away because the alternative was too painful to consider. I thought about Pascal's tone when he spoke to me lately, always slightly impatient, like I was interrupting something important just by existing in the same space. When he came home from work and found me in the kitchen cooking dinner, he'd nod politely, but there was something in his expression, something that made me feel like I was trespassing in my own home. I thought about Sylvia's quick, tight smiles when I offered to help with dinner or suggested activities with the kids. Those smiles never reached her eyes anymore, and I'd been telling myself she was just tired from work, stressed about money, going through a difficult phase. But it wasn't a phase, was it? It was who she'd become. Or maybe who she'd always been beneath the surface. Maybe the little girl who used to crawl into bed with me during thunderstorms had grown into a woman who saw love as obligation and family as burden. I thought about how they'd rearranged the house last year, moving my bedroom to the basement while converting my old room into Pascal's home office. They'd explained it so reasonably. The basement was cooler in summer, quieter, more private. I'd have my own little apartment down there, they said. My own space where I could watch my programs without disturbing anyone. What they didn't say was that they were literally putting me out of sight, creating physical distance that reflected the emotional distance that had been growing for years. Privacy. What a joke. They'd banished me to the basement like some embarrassing relative you hide when company comes over. And I'd been grateful. Actually grateful that they'd thought to give me my own space, that they'd made room for me in their busy lives. God, how pathetic I must have seemed to them. How easy to manipulate. The basement room was nice enough, I suppose. Sylvia had helped me decorate it with some of my furniture from the old house, Richard's reading chair, my mother's quilts, family photos that documented a life that felt increasingly distant from my current reality. But it was still a basement, still below ground level, still a place where you put things you want to keep but don't really want to see every day. I pulled out my phone and called my friend Eleanor, the only person I'd stayed close to since Richard died. Eleanor had been trying to tell me for years that Sylvia was taking advantage of me, but I'd always defended my daughter. Family is family, I'd said. Blood is thicker than water. She's going through a hard time. The kids need stability. All those platitudes we tell ourselves when we're afraid to face the truth, that the people we love most are the ones hurting us most. Eleanor had been my neighbor for 15 years before I moved in with Sylvia and Pascal. She'd known Richard almost as long as I had been there through his diagnosis, his treatment, his final weeks when the cancer finally won. She'd held my hand at the funeral and helped me pack up our house when Sylvia insisted I couldn't live alone anymore. Eleanor had questioned that decision from the beginning, but I'd been so lost in grief, so desperate not to be alone with my memories, that I'd seen Sylvia's invitation as a lifeline rather than what it really was, a way for her to gain control over my life and my assets. "Eleanor," I said when she answered, trying to keep my voice steady, "I think I need a lawyer." There was a pause, the kind of pause that comes when someone's been expecting bad news and finally hears it. Eleanor had been waiting for this call for 3 years. "What happened, honey?" I told her about the conversation I'd overheard, about Pascal's casual cruelty, about the slow erosion of my place in what I'd thought was my own family. I told her about the basement room and the tight smiles, and the way I'd started feeling like I needed permission to exist in my own life. Eleanor listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. She's always been quick with advice and opinions, never one to let silence stretch too long. "Faith," she said finally, and her voice was careful in a way that scared me. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I probably should have told you years ago, but I kept hoping you'd figure it out on your own." My stomach clenched. After the conversation I'd just overheard, I wasn't sure I could handle any more revelations about how blind I'd been. "What? The house you're living in, Pascal and Sylvia's house? It's not theirs. It's yours." The world tilted sideways. I felt like I was falling through space, like the bench beneath me had disappeared, and I was tumbling through some alternate reality where nothing made sense. "What are you talking about? When Richard died, he left everything to you. The house, the investments, his life insurance, everything. I remember because you asked me to help you go through the paperwork. You were so overwhelmed with grief, so lost. You couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't even remember what day it was most of the time. Sylvia offered to handle the legal details, said she'd take care of transferring everything into a trust for the family, make sure you were protected." I felt like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart with an icy fist. She said Richard left the house to her. That's why they let me stay. That's why I've been so grateful. I thought they were being generous, giving me a place to live when I had nothing. Oh, honey. Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm, the way she used to talk to her students when she was still teaching high school English and had to deliver difficult news about failing grades or college rejections. Richard would never have left you without a home. He loved you too much. He spent months before he died making sure every detail was in place to take care of you. I think you need to look at those papers again. The real ones. The drive home was a blur of stop signs and traffic lights that seemed to exist in some other universe. My mind was reeling with possibilities. I was afraid to examine too closely. Memories I'd been suppressing about those first weeks. After Richard's funeral, when everything felt like it was happening to someone else, Sylvia had been so helpful then, so organized and efficient when I could barely function. She'd taken care of everything, the funeral arrangements, the insurance claims, the legal paperwork. I'd been grateful to have someone competent handling the details, while I tried to figure out how to breathe without the man I'd loved for 45 years. But what if her helpfulness hadn't been kindness? What if it had been opportunity? The house was quiet when I got back. Sylvia and Pascal had taken the kids to soccer practice, something they did every Tuesday evening. Emma played midfielder on her school team, and Jake was just starting in the under-8 league. I usually went with them, cheering from the sidelines and bringing snacks for after the games. The kids expected me there, counted on Mimi being in the stands to wave at them when they made a good play. But today I'd begged off, claiming a headache, and now I was grateful for the solitude. I went down to my basement bedroom and opened the file cabinet, where I kept important documents. It was an old metal cabinet that Richard and I had bought when we were first married, back when filing systems seemed like the height of adult sophistication. The drawers stuck sometimes, and you had to jiggle the handle just right to get them open. Sylvia had suggested I get a new one several times, something more modern and secure, but I liked the familiar difficulty of the old cabinet. It felt like keeping a piece of my real life in this strange new existence. The papers were there, just as Eleanor remembered. Richard's will, clear as day, leaving everything to me with careful provisions for Sylvia's inheritance after my death. There was also a folder I'd forgotten about, labeled Trust Documents in Sylvia's handwriting. The very sight of her neat penmanship made my hands shake. I opened it with trembling fingers, dreading what I might find. It wasn't a trust at all. It was a power of attorney document, signed by me during those horrible first weeks after the funeral when I could barely function. I remembered signing it vaguely. Sylvia had brought it to me along with a stack of other papers, explaining that it would make things easier, that she could handle the bank accounts and insurance companies so I wouldn't have to deal with the stress of phone calls and meetings when I was grieving. But the power of attorney was supposed to be temporary, just to help me handle immediate financial matters while I got back on my feet. According to these papers, though, Sylvia had used it to transfer ownership of everything: the house, the bank accounts, Richard's pension, even his life insurance payout into her and Pascal's names. The transfers had happened over a period of months, carefully spaced out so nothing would look suspicious to the banks or insurance companies. I sat on my narrow basement bed, surrounded by papers that proved I'd been systematically robbed by my own daughter, and something inside me crystallized. Not anger, exactly, though that would come later. This was something colder and more purposeful, like ice forming on a pond in the first freeze of winter. This was the moment when 45 years of motherhood ended, and something else began, something harder and more ruthless than the woman who'd raised a daughter with infinite patience and unconditional love. I called Eleanor back, my voice steady now in a way that surprised me. I need that lawyer's name. Tonight. Eleanor didn't ask questions. She'd known me long enough to recognize the tone that meant I'd moved past shock and into action. Her name is Patricia Morrison. I'll text you her number. Faith, be careful. This kind of thing, it destroys families. My family destroyed itself, I said, and hung up. The lawyer's name was Patricia Morrison, and she agreed to see me the next morning after I explained the basic situation. Her office was downtown in one of those imposing glass buildings that make you feel like serious business happens there, the kind of place where people in expensive suits make decisions that change lives. I'd dressed carefully for the meeting, my navy blue suit that I'd worn to Richard's funeral, my good pearls, sensible heels that didn't make noise when I walked. I wanted to look like someone who deserved to be taken seriously, not like a confused old woman who'd been taken advantage of. Patricia Morrison turned out to be about my age, with steel gray hair cut in a sharp bob and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her office was all polished wood and leather-bound books, with diplomas on the wall that spoke of decades of experience handling complicated family situations. She offered me coffee, which I accepted gratefully. I'd been too nervous to eat breakfast, and the caffeine helped steady my hands. "This is financial elder abuse," she said after reviewing my documents for nearly an hour. "Quite serious. The power of attorney should have expired when you recovered from your initial grief, and using it to transfer assets to themselves was illegal. They've essentially stolen your entire estate and then convinced you to be grateful for the privilege of living in your own house. What can we do?" Patricia leaned back in her leather chair, studying me with the kind of attention that made me feel like she was reading my entire life story in my face. "We can do quite a lot, actually. The transfers were fraudulent. We can force them to return everything that was stolen from you, every dollar, every asset, every fraudulent transaction. But first, I need to ask you a difficult question. Do you want to try to salvage your relationship with your daughter, or do you want justice?" I thought about Pascal calling me worthless while I stood holding groceries I'd bought for his family with my own money. I thought about 10 years of being treated like a live-in servant who should be grateful for the privilege. I thought about Sylvia's tight smiles and the way she'd moved me to the basement like unwanted furniture. I thought about my grandchildren, who I loved more than life itself, and how I was about to lose them because their parents had chosen greed over family. I want justice. Patricia smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. "Then let's get started." The first step was getting copies of all the financial records. Patricia filed a motion requiring Sylvia and Pascal to produce complete documentation of all transactions involving my assets over the past 10 years. While we waited for that, she had me do something that felt both terrifying and liberating. She had me apply for my own apartment. "You need an exit strategy," she explained. "Once this gets ugly, and it will get very ugly, you won't want to stay in that house. You need somewhere to go that's completely yours, where they can't manipulate or control you." The apartment hunting process was surreal. I hadn't looked for a place to live in decades, hadn't even thought about what I might want in a home if I had complete freedom to choose. For the past 10 years, I'd been living in someone else's space, accommodating their preferences, fitting myself into the corners of their life. Now, I was looking at apartments and thinking about what would make me happy, what would give me peace. I found a beautiful 2-bedroom apartment in a senior living community called Sunset Gardens, about 20 minutes away from Sylvia and Pascal's house, my house. I corrected myself. The community was designed for active adults who wanted independence with the security of nearby services. My apartment had hardwood floors and a small balcony overlooking a garden where residents grew flowers and vegetables. The kitchen was compact but perfectly designed for one person who actually enjoyed cooking for herself rather than constantly feeding other people who barely acknowledged the effort. The community center had a library, an art studio, a fitness center, and a dining room where residents could eat together if they chose. There were organized activities, book clubs, walking groups, day trips to museums and theaters, but no pressure to participate. It was exactly what I hadn't known I'd been wanting. A place where I could be as social or as solitary as I felt like being on any given day. The community was full of people like me, older adults, who'd survived their share of life's storms and found peace in simplicity. My potential neighbor was a retired high school principal named Frank, who'd been widowed 2 years earlier. He helped me carry my purse and paperwork when I struggled with the building's heavy doors, and told me stories about his travels to Ireland and Scotland with his late wife. Another neighbor, Diane, was a former pediatric nurse who'd escaped an abusive marriage in her 60s and rebuilt her life from scratch. The hardest part? Diane told me one afternoon as we sat in the community garden during my second visit, was realizing that the people I thought loved me had been using me all along. But once you accept that, once you really accept it, instead of making excuses for them, you become free in a way you never imagined possible. I put down a deposit using money from a small savings account. Sylvia didn't know about my mad money that Richard had always insisted I keep separate. He'd been old-fashioned about some things, insisting that every married woman should have her own private account that her husband couldn't access, just in case. Not because I don't trust you, he'd said, but because I want you to never have to depend on anyone else's permission to take care of yourself. At the time, I'd thought it was unnecessary, even a little insulting to our marriage. Now I understood it was one of the greatest gifts he'd ever given me. Meanwhile, Patricia was building our case with the methodical precision of someone who'd seen this kind of family betrayal before. The financial records, when they finally arrived, told a story that was even worse than I'd imagined. It wasn't just that Sylvia and Pascal had stolen my money, they'd been living entirely off my assets, while convincing me I was a burden they were generously supporting. The house payments, the utilities, the groceries, the kids' school fees, their car payments, Pascal's golf club membership, Sylvia's gym membership, their vacation to Disney World last year. It's all been coming from your accounts, Patricia explained during one of our meetings. They've been living off your money while making you feel grateful for their charity. The cruelest detail was the life insurance. Richard had left me a substantial policy meant to ensure I'd never have to worry about money, that I could maintain our standard of living and maybe even travel a little, see some of the places we'd always planned to visit together. Sylvia had used the power of attorney to claim the payout immediately, then invested it in her and Pascal's retirement accounts. She literally profited from her father's death, Patricia said, and then convinced you that you were dependent on her generosity. As the legal proceedings moved forward, I started making my move out of the house. I did it gradually, taking a few things each week to my new apartment. Clothes, books, photo albums, my mother's china that Sylvia had borrowed for special occasions but never returned. Each item I reclaimed felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that I'd given away without realizing it. My mother's china had been particularly hard to ask for back. It was a set of Spode that had been in our family for 3 generations, passed down from mother to daughter along with the stories of the women who'd used it before me. Sylvia had asked to borrow it for a dinner party 3 years ago, promising to return it the next week. But somehow it had ended up in her dining room cabinet, and whenever I mentioned it, she'd say she was still using it for special occasions and would get it back to me soon. Getting it back required steeling myself for confrontation. I waited until Sylvia was at work and the kids were at school, then asked Pascal to help me load the boxes into my car. "Why do you need it?" he asked, looking genuinely confused. "Sylvia uses it all the time. You're just going to put it in storage or something." "It's mine," I said simply. "It belonged to my mother and my grandmother before her. I want it in my apartment." "Your apartment?" His voice sharpened. "What apartment? I've rented a place in Sunset Gardens. I'll be moving there soon." The look that crossed Pascal's face was almost comical confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been panic. "You can't move out. What about the kids? What about Sylvia? You can't just abandon your family." The irony was breathtaking. The man who'd called me worthless and a parasite was now talking about family loyalty. I'm not abandoning anyone, I said calmly. I'm just making sure I have options. That evening, Sylvia confronted me as I was heating up leftovers for dinner. The kids were upstairs doing homework, and Pascal was in his office, my old bedroom, on a work call. Sylvia stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, looking exactly like she had as a teenager when she was about to demand an explanation for some perceived injustice. Pascal says you're moving out. What's this about, Mom? I turned to face her, this woman who looked so much like me at that age, but had become someone I didn't recognize. I think it's time I had my own space. But this is your space. This is your home. Is it? I kept my voice level, conversational. Because I live in the basement, and when I overheard you and Pascal talking yesterday, it sounded like you both feel I'm more of a burden than a family member. Sylvia's face flushed red. You were eavesdropping? I was coming home from the grocery store. You were talking in the kitchen with the windows open. I didn't mean to overhear, but I did. Pascal called me worthless, Sylvia. He called me a parasite, and you agreed with him. That's not, we were just frustrated. We've been stressed about money lately, and sometimes people say things they don't mean. Do they? Because it sounded like you meant it. It sounded like you've been thinking it for a long time. Sylvia looked away, unable to meet my eyes. I don't know what you want me to say. I don't want you to say anything. I want you to think about whether you actually want me here, or whether you just think you should want me here. Because there's a difference, and I'm finally old enough to know which is which. The conversation ended there, but something had shifted. Sylvia and Pascal noticed something was different, but they couldn't quite put their finger on what. I was still there, still doing most of the cooking, and cleaning old habits die hard. But there was a distance now, a quality of emotional remove that I don't think they'd ever experienced from me before. When Pascal made his usual casual demands, Faith, the kids need to be picked up from school, or Faith, we're having guests for dinner tomorrow, I started responding with polite but firm boundaries. I'm not available tomorrow, I'd say. You'll need to make other arrangements. What do you mean you're not available? Sylvia asked one evening, genuine confusion in her voice. Where are you going? I have plans, I said simply, which was true. I was planning to have dinner with Frank and watch a movie in my own apartment, in my own space, where no one could call me worthless. The legal showdown came on a cold Tuesday morning in March. Patricia had arranged for a settlement conference with Sylvia and Pascal's lawyer. They'd been forced to hire representation once they realized the scope of what was happening. The discovery process had revealed every fraudulent transaction, every lie, every dollar stolen over the past 10 years. Their lawyer had tried to argue that it was all a misunderstanding, that Sylvia had been acting in my best interests, but the evidence was overwhelming. I insisted on being present for the conference, despite Patricia's suggestion that I let her handle it. I want to see their faces, I told her. I want to see their faces when they realize what they've done. The conference room was all polished wood and leather chairs, the kind of place where important decisions get made by people in expensive suits. Sylvia and Pascal sat across from me with their lawyer, a nervous-looking young man named Stevens, who kept shuffling papers and avoiding eye contact. Sylvia looked pale and drawn, like she hadn't been sleeping well. Pascal's usual confidence was nowhere to be seen. He kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Patricia laid out the case with devastating clarity. Every fraudulent transfer, every lie, every dollar stolen over the past 10 years. She had financial records, expert testimony, and a clear timeline showing how they'd systematically drained my accounts while convincing me I was a charity case they were generously supporting. The total amount fraudulently transferred from Mrs. Henderson's accounts over the past 10 years is approximately $847,000, Patricia announced. This includes the house, which was purchased outright with Mr. Henderson's life insurance payout, all investment accounts, pension distributions, and ongoing Social Security payments that were redirected to accounts controlled by Mr. and Mrs. Foster. Pascal's face went through several interesting changes: confusion, disbelief, and finally, a kind of pale panic as he realized what they were facing. Sylvia just stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, like she was looking at a stranger who happened to be wearing her mother's face. "This is ridiculous," Pascal finally sputtered. "Faith's been living in our house, eating our food, using our utilities." "Your house?" Patricia interrupted smoothly. "Let's talk about whose house it really island." She slid a document across the table. It was the original deed, showing that the house had been fully paid off years before Richard died, and that I was the sole legal owner. Every mortgage payment Sylvia and Pascal thought they'd been making had actually been coming from my accounts, transferred automatically through the fraudulent power of attorney. "You've been paying your mother-in-law's property taxes and utilities with her own money," Patricia continued, "while convincing her she was a burden you were generously supporting. In effect, Mrs. Henderson has been paying for the privilege of being abused in her own home." Sylvia's lawyer whispered urgently in her ear. Sylvia's face crumpled, and for a moment, she looked like the little girl who used to run to me with scraped knees and bruised feelings. But then I remembered Pascal's voice calling me worthless, and that moment of maternal softness hardened into something much colder. "We want full restitution," Patricia announced. "Every dollar transferred fraudulently, plus interest and penalties. We want all property returned to Mrs. Henderson's name immediately, and we want them out of her house within 30 days. 30 days? Sylvia's voice was barely a whisper. "You've had 10 years to find your own place," I said, speaking for the first time since we'd sat down. 30 days is generous. The negotiations that followed were swift and brutal. Pascal tried to argue that they'd made improvements to the house, that they deserved some consideration for caring for me all these years. Patricia demolished each argument with surgical precision. "You made improvements to someone else's property without permission," she pointed out. "That's not an investment, it's trespassing. And as for care, Mrs. Henderson has been supporting your entire family financially, while providing free childcare, housekeeping, and cooking services. If anything, you owe her for 10 years of unpaid labor." Stevens, their lawyer, tried a different approach. "My clients were under the impression that they were helping Mrs. Henderson manage her affairs during a difficult time. They never intended—" "Intent is irrelevant," Patricia cut him off. "Elder financial abuse is a crime regardless of intent. Your clients systematically stole nearly $1 million from a grieving widow and then convinced her she should be grateful for their generosity. The evidence is overwhelming, and frankly, Mrs. Henderson is being generous by seeking civil rather than criminal remedies. In the end, they had no choice. The evidence was overwhelming, and fighting it would only make their situation worse. They agreed to return everything: the house, the bank accounts, the investments, even the life insurance money they'd been treating as their own retirement fund. The total restitution, with interest and penalties, came to over $1 million. The day they moved out was surprisingly peaceful. I'd expected drama, tears, angry confrontations. Instead, Sylvia and Pascal packed their belongings with the mechanical efficiency of people in shock. The kids were confused and upset, asking why they had to leave Grandma's house, not understanding that it had always been Grandma's house. Emma, my 12-year-old granddaughter, found me in the kitchen as I was packing away the good dishes, my mother's china, that I'd finally reclaimed. "Mimi," she said, using the name she'd called me since she was 2, "are you mad at us?" I knelt down to her level, looking into eyes that were exactly like Sylvia's had been at that age. "I'm not mad at you, sweetheart. I could never be mad at you." "Then why can't we stay here anymore?" "Daddy says we have to move to an apartment, and I have to change schools." That was the hardest part, knowing that I was losing my relationship with my grandchildren because of their parents' greed and deception. But I also knew that continuing to enable Sylvia and Pascal would have taught those children that love means accepting abuse, that family means exploitation disguised as duty. Sometimes grown-ups make choices that affect everyone, I said carefully. Your parents made some choices that hurt me very much, and now there are consequences for those choices. What kind of choices? That's something you'll need to talk to your parents about when you're older. Jake, who was only 8, wandered into the kitchen looking for his favorite snack, the homemade granola bars I made for him every week. Mimi, are you coming with us to the new house? No, sweetheart, I'm going to stay here. But who's going to make my granola bars? Your mom knows how to make them. I taught her when she was about your age. I watched from my living room window as they loaded the last boxes into their rental truck. Sylvia came to the door one final time, standing on the porch where I'd overheard Pascal's cruel words months earlier. She looked older somehow, like the stress of the legal proceedings had aged her beyond her 43 years. Mom, she said, and her voice was small and broken. I never meant for it to go this far. It started as helping you with paperwork, and then you realized how easy it was to take advantage of a grieving widow. I finished quietly. And you decided to keep taking until there was nothing left. That's not how it was, isn't it? I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw a stranger wearing a familiar face. You stole my husband's life insurance. You moved me to the basement like an embarrassing piece of furniture. You let your husband call me worthless while I bought groceries for your family with my own money. You've been living off my assets for 10 years, while making me feel like a burden you were generously supporting. Sylvia started to cry then, but I felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not even pity. Just a vast, clean emptiness where 45 years of unconditional maternal love used to be. I hope you find somewhere safe to live, I said, and I meant it. I hope you find jobs that can support the lifestyle you've been living on my money. And I hope you explain to your children why their grandmother won't be in their lives anymore. I closed the door gently, but firmly, and listened to the sound of the rental truck pulling away from the house that had always been mine. The months that followed were a revelation. I split my time between my old house, which I was gradually renovating to suit my own tastes, rather than accommodating a family, and my apartment in the senior community. The house felt different now that it was truly mine again. I painted the walls colors I liked, rearranged the furniture to suit my preferences, and converted Pascal's old office back into the bedroom I'd given up. I had more money than I'd ever dreamed of, thanks to the investments Richard had made that I'd never known about. Investments Sylvia had been controlling for years. With the restitution payments and the accumulated interest, my financial situation was more secure than it had been even when Richard was alive. I traveled, not the big international trips that Richard and I had always planned but never taken, but smaller adventures that suited my current life. I took a train to San Francisco and spent a week exploring museums and gardens. I visited my sister in Arizona and spent time in the desert, watching sunsets that painted the sky in colors I'd forgotten existed. I drove to the mountains in North Carolina and rented a cabin where I could read and paint watercolors without anyone needing anything from me. I took a cooking class at the community college and learned to make dishes I'd never attempted before: Thai curry, homemade pasta, French pastries that required patience and precision. I learned to paint with oils instead of just watercolors, creating landscapes and still lifes that captured moments of beauty I'd never taken time to notice when I was constantly busy taking care of other people. I volunteered at a literacy center, helping adults learn to read, and discovered I had a gift for patient teaching. My students were mostly older immigrants who'd never had the opportunity for formal education, and they approached learning with a hunger and gratitude that was deeply moving. I found that helping them discover the joy of reading gave me a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with being needed by family members who didn't appreciate me. Most importantly, I learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. I'd been lonely for 10 years, while surrounded by family who saw me as a resource rather than a person. Now, I was often alone, but I was never lonely, because every moment of solitude was a choice I made for myself, rather than something imposed on me by people who found my presence inconvenient. Frank from the senior community became a close friend, and eventually something more. He was 71 to my 68, a retired high school principal who'd lost his wife to Alzheimer's 3 years earlier. Unlike the men who'd occasionally asked me out during my marriage, always with the assumption that I was looking for someone to take care of me, Frank was interested in my thoughts, my experiences, my dreams for this unexpected chapter of my life. We started with walks around the community gardens, talking about books and movies and the peculiar freedom that comes with outliving your obligations to ungrateful people. Frank had his own story of family disappointment, adult children who lived across the country, and called on holidays but had never visited since his wife's funeral. He understood the particular pain of realizing that the people you devoted your life to had been calculating the value of your existence in purely practical terms. The hardest part, he told me one evening as we sat on my apartment balcony watching the sunset, was accepting that my love had been conditional for them, even though theirs never was for me. I kept thinking if I just tried harder, gave more, needed less, they'd remember how to care about me as a person instead of just as a resource. We took that cruise I'd mentioned to Eleanor, a 2-week trip through the Mediterranean that was everything Richard and I had planned, but never managed to take. Frank and I wandered through ancient ruins in Greece, ate gelato in Rome, and spent long afternoons on the ship's deck reading books and talking about the strange gift of starting over in your 70s. The physical relationship developed slowly, naturally, without the desperate urgency of young love or the resigned companionship of many older couples. We were two people who discovered that intimacy in later life could be based on genuine compatibility rather than practical necessity. Frank appreciated my intelligence, my strength, my refusal to diminish myself to make others comfortable. I appreciated his gentleness, his respect for my independence, his understanding that I'd rather be alone than compromised. Eleanor was delighted by this development. She'd been worried that the trauma of Sylvia's betrayal would make me bitter and closed off to new relationships. Instead, she watched me bloom in ways that surprised us both. "You're different," she observed one afternoon as we sat in my renovated living room, drinking tea from my mother's china while Frank worked in the garden outside. "Not just happier, though you're definitely that. You're more yourself than you've been in years." She was right. For the first time since Richard's death, maybe even before that, I felt like I was living my own life rather than fitting myself into the spaces other people had allocated for me. I made decisions based on what I wanted rather than what others needed from me. I spent money on things that brought me joy rather than constantly calculating whether I could afford to burden others with my preferences. The house renovation became a physical manifestation of this internal transformation. I hired contractors to knock down the wall between the kitchen and dining room, creating an open space that flowed into the living room. I installed hardwood floors throughout the main level and had the basement converted into a proper guest suite, not a place to hide unwanted family members, but a welcoming space for friends who might visit. I planted a garden in the backyard, something I'd never had time for when I was constantly managing other people's needs. Tomatoes and herbs, flowers that attracted butterflies, a small greenhouse where I could start seedlings in late winter. Frank helped with the heavy work, but the design was entirely mine, a space that reflected my preferences rather than accommodating anyone else's requirements. The most significant change was in my relationship with money. For the first time in my adult life, I had complete control over my financial decisions. The restitution from Sylvia and Pascal, combined with the investments Richard had made that I was finally able to access, meant I was actually wealthy by any reasonable standard. But more important than the amount was the autonomy. No one could limit my spending, question my choices, or make me feel guilty for using my own resources as I saw fit. I bought a new car, a luxury sedan that Frank and I could take on road trips without worrying about reliability. I donated generously to the Literacy Center and several other charities that mattered to me. I set up college funds for Emma and Jake, money they wouldn't be able to access until they were 18, but that would be there regardless of whatever happened with their parents. The question of my grandchildren was the most painful aspect of my new life. I'd lost them as collateral damage in the war Sylvia and Pascal had started by stealing from me. They were too young to understand the legal complexities, too loyal to their parents to maintain a relationship with me against their wishes. Sylvia had made it clear that any attempt to contact them would be seen as harassment. But I wasn't completely cut off. Diane, my neighbor who'd become a close friend, had a daughter who worked at Emma's school. Through this connection, I learned that both children were struggling with the transition. Emma's grades had dropped, and Jake had been getting into fights on the playground. They were living in a cramped apartment across town, and Pascal had been forced to take a second job to pay for their reduced lifestyle. "The girl asks about you," Diane reported after one of these indirect updates. "She wants to know if her grandmother is angry at her, if she did something wrong." These reports broke my heart, but they also strengthened my resolve. I'd made the right choice in demanding justice, rather than continuing to enable their parents' exploitation. Protecting Emma and Jake from the consequences of their parents' choices would have taught them that actions don't have real consequences, that family loyalty means accepting abuse, that love means sacrificing your dignity to keep others comfortable. Instead, I wrote them letters, one for each birthday, one for Christmas, one for the start of each school year. I didn't send them, but I wrote them anyway, telling them about my life, my travels, my hopes for their futures. I wanted them to exist somewhere. These words of love and wisdom from a grandmother who'd been forced out of their lives by their parents' greed. Maybe someday, when they were adults and could make their own decisions about relationships, they'd want to hear these stories. Maybe they'd understand that I'd loved them enough to refuse to model acceptance of mistreatment. Maybe they'd realize that the grandmother who disappeared from their lives hadn't abandoned them, but had been stolen from them by people who valued money more than family. The first Christmas in my renovated house was a revelation. Frank and I hosted dinner for Eleanor and several other friends from the senior community. We cooked together, laughed together, exchanged gifts that reflected genuine knowledge of each other's interests rather than obligatory gestures. No one called me at the last minute to change plans. No one criticized the food or complained about the temperature or made passive-aggressive comments about my choices. After everyone left, Frank and I sat by the fireplace I'd had installed during the renovation, drinking wine and talking about the strange gift of contentment that can come in the 7th decade of life. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Walking away from your family?" I considered the question seriously. It was one I'd been asking myself regularly, testing my resolve against the inevitable moments of doubt and loneliness. "I regret that it was necessary," I said finally. "I regret that my daughter became someone who could steal from her grieving mother and feel justified in doing it. I regret that my grandchildren are paying the price for their parents' choices. But do I regret refusing to accept a life of exploitation disguised as love? Never." Frank nodded, understanding in the way that only someone who'd made similar difficult choices could understand. My therapist told me something once that stuck with me. She said that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their worst impulses, even if they hate you for it. "Your therapist sounds wise," she islanded. "Maybe you'd like to meet with her sometime. Not because there's anything wrong with you, but because talking through these big life changes with someone objective can be helpful." I did start seeing Dr. Sylvia Chen. The irony of the name wasn't lost on me. A therapist who specialized in family trauma and late-life transitions. Our sessions helped me understand that my situation wasn't unique, that financial elder abuse by adult children was disturbingly common, especially among women who'd been socialized to prioritize others' needs over their own. You spent 50 years learning to derive your worth from how useful you were to other people, Dr. Chen observed during one of our sessions. It makes sense that learning to value yourself for who you are rather than what you provide would take time and conscious effort. She was right. The work of rebuilding my sense of self, after decades of defining myself through my relationships to others, was harder than I'd expected. There were days when I felt lost without someone needing me, when the freedom to choose how to spend my time felt overwhelming rather than liberating. But gradually, with Dr. Chen's help and the support of my new community, I learned to sit with that discomfort rather than rushing to fill it with new obligations. I learned to distinguish between healthy interdependence and codependent enabling. I learned that boundaries weren't selfish but necessary, that saying no to one thing meant saying yes to something else. The second anniversary of Sylvia and Pascal's departure passed quietly. I marked it not with sadness but with gratitude. Gratitude for the clarity that had come from their cruelty, for the strength I'd discovered in myself, for the new life I'd built from the ashes of their betrayal. I was in my garden that morning, deadheading roses and planning the fall plantings, when Frank appeared at the gate with coffee and fresh croissants from the bakery we both loved. "Thought you might like company," he said, settling into one of the garden chairs I'd placed strategically throughout the space. "Always," I said, and meant it. We sat in comfortable silence, watching butterflies dance among the flowers, listening to the birds that had made homes in the trees I'd planted. It was exactly the kind of peaceful moment I'd been seeking without knowing it during all those years of chaos and obligation and unappreciated service. My phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor, who was spending the week at her daughter's house in Portland. "Thinking of you today," it read. "Hope you're celebrating your freedom." I was. Not celebrating the destruction of my relationship with Sylvia, not celebrating the pain my grandchildren were experiencing, but celebrating the discovery that I could survive the loss of people I thought I couldn't live without. Celebrating the realization that love without respect isn't love at all, but something much more dangerous. That evening, as Frank and I prepared dinner together in my renovated kitchen, I reflected on the strange mathematics of loss and gain that had defined the past 2 years. I'd lost a daughter, a son-in-law, and 2 grandchildren, but I'd gained a sense of self-worth that didn't depend on other people's approval, a community of friends who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide, and a romantic relationship based on mutual respect rather than practical necessity. I'd lost the illusion of family harmony but gained the reality of authentic connection. I'd lost the security of being needed but gained the freedom of being wanted. I'd lost my role as the family matriarch but discovered my identity as an independent woman with her own dreams and desires. "Do you think they ever think about what they lost?" Frank asked as we cleaned up after dinner. I considered the question while I loaded my mother's china into the dishwasher china that was finally back where it belonged, in cabinets I owned in a house that was undeniably mine. "I think they're probably focused on what they think I took from them," I said. "I don't think they've had time to consider what they threw away. But maybe someday they would. Maybe someday Emma and Jake would be old enough to ask questions about why their grandmother had disappeared from their lives. Maybe they'd want to hear my side of the story, want to understand what had really happened during those legal proceedings that had changed everything. And if that day came, I'd be ready. I'd have stories to tell about the life I'd built after they were gone, stories about travel and friendship and love, and the particular joy that comes with discovering your own strength in your 70s. I'd have wisdom to share about the difference between family and relatives, about the importance of self-respect, about the freedom that comes with refusing to accept less than you deserve. Until then, I had my garden and my books and my art and my travels. I had Frank's steady companionship and Eleanor's fierce loyalty, and Dr. Chen's gentle guidance. I had a community of people who'd also learned to rebuild their lives after major losses, who understood that starting over at any age was possible but not easy. Most of all, I had the deep satisfaction of knowing I'd faced the worst betrayal imaginable, and not only survived, but thrived. I'd looked into the abyss of family dysfunction and chosen justice over peace, truth over comfort, self-respect over false harmony. The truth is, some betrayals are so complete that they become gifts in disguise. Sylvia and Pascal's cruelty had freed me from the prison of false obligation. Their greed had revealed the difference between being needed and being valued. Their lies had shown me that being alone was far better than being with people who didn't respect me. My phone rang as Frank and I settled in to watch a movie, one we'd chosen together, one that reflected our shared interests rather than someone else's preferences. It was an unknown number, and I almost didn't answer. "Hello?" I said, stepping into the kitchen for privacy. "Mimi?" The voice was small, tentative, older than I remembered. "It's Emma." My heart stopped. My granddaughter, now 14, had somehow gotten my number and found the courage to call. "Emma," I breathed. "Oh, sweetheart. I got your number from directory assistance. I hope that's okay. Mom and Dad don't know I'm calling." "It's more than okay. How are you? How's Jake?" We're okay. Different, but okay. Mom got a job at an insurance company, and Dad works at the mall now. We have a smaller apartment, but it's not bad." I could hear the careful loyalty in her voice, the way she was protecting her parents even while reaching out to me. She was growing up, learning the complicated dance of love and disappointment that defines so many family relationships. "I wanted to ask you something," she continued. "Did we do something wrong? Did Jake and I do something that made you go away?" The question broke my heart and mended it simultaneously. Here was my granddaughter, taking responsibility for adult choices she'd had no part in making. "Oh, Emma, no. You and Jake did nothing wrong. Nothing at all. You were perfect then, and I'm sure you're perfect now. Then why don't we see you anymore? Why don't you come to my soccer games or Jake's school plays?" I took a deep breath, knowing that this conversation would define our relationship going forward. I could lie, could protect Sylvia and Pascal by taking responsibility for the estrangement, or I could tell the truth in a way that was age-appropriate but honest. "Your parents made some choices that hurt me very badly," I said carefully. "Choices about money and honesty and respect. When people hurt you that way, sometimes you have to protect yourself by stepping away, even when it means losing people you love very much. But why didn't you try to work it out? Families are supposed to forgive each other. Sometimes forgiveness requires the person who hurt you to acknowledge what they did and try to make it right. And sometimes protecting yourself is more important than keeping peace." There was a long pause. I could hear her breathing, could imagine her sitting in whatever space she'd found for this conversation, trying to make sense of adult complications with a teenager's understanding of fairness. "I miss you," she said finally. "I miss you too, sweetheart. More than you could possibly know. Could I maybe see you sometime? Not at home, because that would cause problems. But maybe we could get coffee or something?" The request filled me with joy and terror in equal measure. Joy at the possibility of reconnection, terror at the potential for more pain if Sylvia and Pascal discovered the contact and ended it. "I would love that more than anything," I said. "But I need you to understand that if your parents find out, they might not let it continue. Are you prepared for that possibility? I'm 14, Mimi. I can make some of my own choices now." And there it was, the strength and independence I'd tried to model for her during the years when I'd been part of her daily life. She was growing into someone who could navigate complicated relationships, who could seek what she needed even when it meant going against her parents' wishes. We made plans to meet the following Saturday at a cafe halfway between our homes. I would get to see my granddaughter, to hear about her life, to share some of the love I'd been storing up for 2 years. Maybe this would be a one-time meeting. Maybe it would be the beginning of a new relationship based on choice rather than obligation. Either way, it was a gift I hadn't expected, a reminder that some relationships can survive even the most devastating family explosions. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, processing the implications of Emma's call. Frank found me there, concern written across his face. "Everything okay?" I told him about the conversation, about the mixture of hope and fear it had awakened in me. He listened without judgment, understanding the complexity of the situation without trying to fix it. "What will you do if her parents find out and forbid contact?" he asked. "I'll respect their authority as her parents," I said, "but I'll also make sure Emma knows that the door is always open, that when she's an adult and can make her own choices, I'll be here." It was the right answer, the mature answer, the answer that prioritized Emma's well-being over my own desires. But it was also honest about the reality that some bridges, once burned, leave permanent scars on the landscape. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the wind in the trees I'd planted, I thought about the strange circularity of loss and recovery. Sylvia and Pascal had taken my family away, but their cruelty had also freed me to build a better life. Their betrayal had cost me my relationship with my grandchildren, but it had also given me the strength to demand respect in all my relationships. And now Emma, the child I'd helped raise for 12 years, was reaching across the divide her parents had created, proving that love can survive even the most calculated attempts to destroy it. Maybe that was the real lesson of these past 2 years, not that family is everything, but that authentic connection transcends the artificial boundaries of obligation and expectation. Maybe the family I'd built with Frank and Eleanor and my community of chosen friends was more real than the one I'd lost to greed and manipulation. Maybe starting over at 68 wasn't a consolation prize, but a second chance to get it right. The Saturday meeting with Emma went better than I dared to hope. She was taller, more mature, with Richard's eyes and my stubborn chin. We talked for 2 hours, carefully avoiding the minefield of her parents' choices, while catching up on the details of our separate lives. She told me about school, about her friends, about the boy she had a crush on, and the college she was already thinking about attending. I told her about my travels, about Frank, about the garden and the volunteer work and the art classes. We were 2 people who loved each other, learning to navigate a relationship that existed outside the traditional family structure. As we said goodbye in the cafe parking lot, Emma hugged me with the fierce intensity of someone who wasn't sure when she'd get another chance. "I'm proud of you for calling me," I told her. "It took courage to reach out when you knew it might cause problems." "I learned from you," she said simply. "You always told me that doing the right thing isn't the same as doing the easy thing." And there it was, proof that the values I'd tried to teach her had taken root despite everything that had happened. She was becoming a young woman who could think for herself, who could distinguish between loyalty and enabling, who could love people while also protecting herself. It was more than I dared to hope for when I'd lost her 2 years earlier. As I drove home to the house that was undeniably mine, to the life I'd built from the ruins of family dysfunction, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: complete peace with my choices. The woman who'd stood outside that kitchen window 2 years ago, listening to her son-in-law call her worthless while she held groceries bought with her own money, was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who knew her own value, someone who'd learned that the greatest gift you can give yourself is the refusal to accept less than you deserve. Sometimes the people who hurt us most give us exactly what we need, not their love, which was always conditional anyway, but the motivation to discover our own strength. Sylvia and Pascal had called me worthless, had treated me like a burden, had stolen from me while convincing me I should be grateful. They were wrong about everything except one thing. The old Faith, the one who accepted scraps of affection in exchange for a lifetime of service, was worthless. But the new Faith, the one sitting in her own kitchen, in her own house, surrounded by people who valued rather than exploited her, she was worth everything.